What follows is drawn from a document submitted to the Cork Quaker Relief Society in the autumn of 1849. The original runs to 41 handwritten pages in a careful, educated hand, the kind of hand that had been trained on slates at a hedge school and had never forgotten the discipline of it. The document was received by a society committeeman named Thomas Bolai, who examined the woman who submitted it and recorded in his notes that she was approximately 28 years of age, thin but clear-eyed, and that she spoke without embellishment or visible distress, in the manner of someone who had already done her grieving in private and had come here to do something more useful than grieve. He noted that her account was extraordinary in nature and that he was forwarding it to the Dublin office for further consideration. What the Dublin office did with it is not recorded. The document passed through various archival hands over the following century and a half, was misfiled at least twice, and was rediscovered in 2019 during a cataloging project undertaken by volunteers. It had never been made public. The woman who submitted it gave her name as Máire Ó'Súilleabháin, formerly of Kilcrony townland in the barony of Ibrican, County Clare. She gave no further address. The document begins without preamble. It begins, "I want to set down what happened at Morven House so that it will not be lost entirely, because I know what I saw and I know what was done to the people who were brought there, and I will not have it buried simply because it is difficult to believe. I have carried this since the winter of 1847, and I am tired of carrying it alone. What she carried, and what was done, and how she came to carry it out of that house on a winter night and into the cold of the Clare countryside. This is that story." Ireland in the winter of 1847 was not a country any longer in any sense that would have been recognizable to the people who had lived there 5 years before. The catastrophe had been growing since 1845, when the blight first came in off the Atlantic and turned the potato harvest to black rot in the ground within days, the stalks collapsing, the tubers reduced to a stinking black liquid when they were pulled, the smell of it rising across the whole country like a verdict. That first year people said it would be 1 year, and they drew on whatever reserves they had and they endured, because the Irish had been enduring for a long time before this and knew how it was done. The second year it came again, and the reserves were gone, and the enduring had to deepen into something that had no comfortable name. And by the third year, the autumn of 1847, the catastrophe had become something beyond the ordinary language of disaster. It had become a condition. It had settled into the land and into the people who lived on it with the permanence of a geological fact, and the word famine, which had seemed sufficient at the beginning, no longer encompassed what was happening. What was happening was the end of a world. She had grown up in Kilcrony, a townland of about 60 families clustered on the rocky western edge of County Clare, where the Atlantic came in hard and cold, and the land was thin-soiled limestone that required every ounce of a family's skill and labor simply to coax enough from it to live on in good years. In good years the potato was a miracle. It was a crop you could grow in bad soil, a crop that returned vastly more food per acre than anything else available to a poor family, a crop that an entire civilization had quietly arranged itself around because it was that reliable and that abundant and that nourishing. In good years Kilcrony was poor but alive, and there was music in the evenings when the work was done, and Máire's father Donal kept bees along the south wall of the cottage and sold honey at the market in Enistamin, and her mother Nora sang under her breath while she worked at the churn, songs half in Irish and half in something older than Irish that Máire could never quite follow the words of. And Máire herself had gone to the hedge school under old Fionborough, and had proved herself the best reader and the best reasoner he had ever had under his roof in 30 years of teaching, so that by the time she was 17, she was effectively teaching half his classes for him while he dozed by the fire and looked pleased with himself. She had loved the work of it. She had loved the sensation of watching understanding arrive in a child's face, the moment when a word became a thing, when a number became a truth, when a sentence stopped being a row of shapes and started being a voice. She had thought in those years that this was what she would do. She had thought teaching was enough of a future to be going on with. That world was gone. It had been going for 2 years when November of 1847 arrived, and it finished its going in those weeks. The third blight had come, and the stalks had collapsed, and the ground had given nothing. And by November the people of Kilcrony were dying in numbers that could not be counted, only witnessed. The hedge school had closed in the previous spring, because there were no children left to attend it in the numbers that would justify its maintaining. And old Fionborough had gone to a cousin in Galway, and Máire had come home to the cottage, and found that the work of surviving had replaced every other kind of work entirely. Her father Donal had died the previous February, a week after the last of the honey was eaten. He had been a large and specific man, a man whose hands had seemed too big for any indoor space he stood in, whose voice carried further than he ever intended, who laughed at things other people had not yet understood were funny, and was then embarrassed about having laughed first. He died weighing less than Máire did, and he died in the way that people died that year, not dramatically but quietly, simply ceasing, as though the body had made a reasonable decision based on available information, and acted on it without making a fuss. She had buried him herself with the help of the 2 Malone brothers from the far end of the townland, and she had said the prayers her mother could not stand to say, and she had come back to the cottage and made a calculation that she was still making every day since, how to apportion what remained among those who remained. Her mother Nora was not well. She had not been well since before Donal died, and grief had made her worse in the way that grief does when the body is already at the margins of its resources. It uses what is left of a person and does not give it back. The winter of 1847 found Nora barely able to rise from the bed of a morning. She had a cough that had settled into the space below her ribs and would not shift, that woke her at night and left her gasping, and Máire tried not to think too precisely about what kind of cough it was because she could not afford the precision. She focused on what could be done. What could be done was this: fetch water from the stream, boil it because the stream was no longer clean, find whatever turnip or wild plant she could along the edges of the road or the common land, talk to her brother Seamus, who was 11 years old and thin as a lath, and looked at her sometimes with a question in his eyes that she did not know how to answer. There were perhaps 30 people left in Kilcrony by November. There had been 60 families 2 years before. Some had died. Some had emigrated, she could not always tell, from the evidence of empty cottages and cold hearths, which of those 2 outcomes had produced a given silence. The families she had known her whole life were absent from their houses, and the houses stood with their doors open, and their roofs beginning to sag and their hearths cold. And she tried not to let herself think about the specifics of those families, because if she let herself think about the specifics there was nowhere useful to go with the thinking, and uselessness in that winter was a luxury she could not afford. She had a habit, cultivated at old Fionborough's school, of noticing things. She noticed the way the dying happened, the sequence of it, the signs that preceded it. She noticed which families went first and what conditions they shared. She noticed the way the road changed week by week as more people used it as their last resource, walking toward town or toward the coast or toward anywhere that was not here. And she noticed the way the road also collected those who did not make it, and she did not let her mind rest long on what it collected. She noticed patterns. It was the mind she had been given, and she had never been able to turn it off entirely, even when turning it off would have been, in some moments, a mercy. She did not know, in November of 1847, that this habit of notice was going to save her life. She only knew that she was frightened in a way that had no specific object, the way you are frightened when the thing you are frightened of has already arrived and is not coming but is simply present, sitting in the room with you, and there is nothing to do about it but be precise. Fitzmaurice came on a Tuesday morning in the second week of November. He arrived in a cart, not a fine cart, not a carriage, but a solid work cart pulled by a gray horse in better condition than anything else Máire had seen in months. The cart was driven by a man she did not know, A Cork man by his accent who seemed uncomfortable to be where he was but who kept his eyes on the road and kept driving. Fitzmaurice rode beside him. He was a small, precise man in his 50s with a wool coat that had seen better days, but was still a great deal better than anything worn anywhere in Kilcrony. He carried a ledger under his arm, and he knocked at each cottage that still showed smoke from its chimney, and he went inside, and he spoke, and he wrote in the ledger, and then he moved on to the next. Máire watched him from a distance before she let herself be seen. She had learned this from the school too: look at a thing before you put your hand to it. Understand the shape of it first. What Fitzmaurice said, when she eventually opened the door to him, was this. He worked for a Mr. Edmund Corrin, who was the owner of Morven House estate, some 12 miles to the east in a more sheltered part of the county. Mr. Corrin was a man of unusual sympathies for his class and position. He had opened his house to those who had need. He was offering food, shelter, and warmth to any who would come, with no conditions and no labor required in return. The estate had a kitchen garden and a storehouse that remained, inexplicably, in good supply, and Mr. Corrin felt it would be unconscionable to keep this abundance to himself, while others starved not 3 hours' ride away. There was room for perhaps a dozen more people. Those who came could stay as long as they needed. Máire listened to this carefully and felt two things simultaneously, in the way she often felt two things at once when a situation called for it. The first was a desperate, bodily pull toward the word food, a pull she could not have resisted entirely even if she had wanted to, because months of insufficient eating had made that word into something more powerful than a word. The second was the cool, measuring voice that old Fionborough had spent years cultivating in the back of her skull, the voice that said, "When a thing sounds like a miracle, look at it harder." She asked Fitzmaurice a number of questions. She asked what Mr. Corrin's connection to the county was and how long he had owned the estate. She asked how many people were currently at the house. She asked what specifically was meant by no conditions. She asked who else from this area had been offered the same arrangement, and whether she might speak to any of them before making a decision. Fitzmaurice answered everything with a patience that could have been genuine or could have been rehearsed. She could not determine which from outside. Corrin had owned the estate for many years, having inherited it, and had chosen to remain in Ireland when many landlords had returned to England as conditions worsened, which was itself unusual, and had occasioned some comment in the county. There were currently 4 people at the house: a young married couple from near Kilrush, an older farmer from east of Innes, and the older farmer's young nephew, a boy. There were no conditions because Mr. Corrin genuinely asked only that people come and allow themselves to be fed. He did not believe in extracting labor from people in desperate circumstances. He did not believe in attaching obligations to acts of charity. When she pressed this point, he looked mildly pained and said simply that some men were different from others, and that Mr. Corrin happened to be one of them. She thought about it for the rest of that day. She thought about her mother's cough and her brother's hollow face, and the cottage with its empty shelves, and the cold coming in at the gaps in the thatch that she had not yet managed to fix. She made the calculation. She ran it several ways, and the answer came out the same each time. The difficult part was the people she was leaving behind. She arranged, over the following days, for Seamus to go and stay with the Sullivan family, 3 doors down, where Mare Bridget Sullivan had 2 sons of her own, and whose situation was slightly less dire than most, and who agreed to take the boy in a spirit of the mutual support that was the only thing holding the remaining families of Kilcrony together. Seamus did not want to go. He looked at her with the question again, the one she never quite knew how to answer, and she took his face in her hands and said she was going east to find food and she would come back for him. She did not know whether the second part of this was true. She wanted it to be true. Her mother was the harder problem. Nora could not be moved to the Sullivan house. She could barely be moved from the bed to the chair by the fire. After an afternoon and evening of quiet inquiry among what remained of Kilcrony, Máire arranged for her mother to be transferred, on a hand cart with 2 borrowed blankets, to the workhouse at Enistamin, 8 miles away. She had heard the things people said about the workhouses, and she did not dispute any of them. But her mother would die in the cottage otherwise, and at least the workhouse was a roof and something to eat, and she had to believe that a woman who had survived as long and as stubbornly as Máire Ó'Súilleabháin might survive this too. When she told her mother what was happening, Nora did not argue. She looked at Máire for a long time in a way that memorized her, and then she allowed herself to be lifted onto the cart. This silence from a woman who had always had an opinion about everything was the most frightening thing in a year full of frightening things. And Máire did not let herself think about it once she had turned away. She left Kilcrony on a Thursday morning before light. Fitzmaurice's cart came for her and one other woman from a further townland, a woman named Saoirse who was too exhausted to speak, and who sat wrapped in a grey shawl in the back of the cart, and looked at the passing countryside with an expression that was not quite seeing. The Cork man drove without speaking. The horse moved steadily. The road east was 12 miles of the end of everything. She had been through bad countryside since the blight began, but this stretch exceeded her previous experience of it by degrees she had not prepared herself for. The fields on both sides of the road had been stripped so completely that there was nothing left to indicate they had ever grown anything. No stubble, no hedging, not even the shape of old ridge and furrow visible in the waterlogged soil. The land looked not merely failed but erased, as though someone had taken the memory of cultivation out of it along with the harvest. The ditches along the road were the worst of it, and she looked at the far distance and not at the ditches, as the Cork man was also doing, and she did not allow herself to see what she was not looking at. She noticed, because she always noticed, the exact place where the landscape changed. It was not gradual. Around a long bend in the road, past a stand of bare oak trees whose branches were black and stripped against a grey sky, she saw the walls of Morven House estate, and above the walls green. The walls were high, 8 or 9 feet of old cut limestone, running for what seemed like a quarter-mile before the gate. And above the top of the wall she could see the dense dark green foliage of what she eventually understood were kale and turnips in the walled kitchen garden, their leaves thick and vigorous as though it were high summer rather than the back end of November. Beyond them, further back, the canopy of some kind of orchard, the trees bare but for that the branches were dense and healthy. And the whole of it was impossible. The whole of it was wrong in the way that a fire burning in the middle of the ocean would be wrong, or a single house still standing in the middle of a field of ruins. She told herself she was imagining it. She looked at Saoirse, who had come out of her stupor, and was looking at the walls with the same expression Máire could feel on her own face, the expression of someone encountering something they cannot yet name. The iron gate was standing open. Fitzmaurice was there before them, having come ahead on horseback. He stood in the gateway speaking to a woman in a grey dress and a white cap, upright, efficient, with a face that had been trained out of unnecessary expression. Fitzmaurice introduced her as Mrs. Hatch, the housekeeper of Morven House. Mrs. Hatch looked at Máire and Saoirse without warmth or coldness, made a brief and comprehensive assessment, and told them to follow her. The drive was raked gravel clean. On either side grass grew, thin November grass, yes, but growing green, the unmistakable color of life. The house came into view as they rounded a line of bare beech trees, and she made herself look at it steadily, the way she had been taught to look at difficult things. It was Georgian, 4 stories of pale limestone, 12 windows across the main facade, a pillared entrance doorway. It had the standard proportions of the large Protestant houses built across Clare and Galway for the last century and a half, the houses that had always occupied the Irish landscape with a quality of not quite belonging to it, claiming it rather than growing from it, but where most of those houses had acquired the signs of absentee neglect, crumbling pointing, peeling paint, the slow dissolution of things when no one is watching. Morven House was in extraordinary repair. The pointing was fresh. The windows were clean. The glazing bars were painted white and recently. She noticed this immediately and felt the noticing land somewhere in the back of her mind, where she kept the things she was not yet ready to name. Inside was warm, not the desperate warmth of a barely sustained peat fire, but real warmth, even heat, moving through the ground floor of the house from proper fireplaces well fueled with coal and good timber. Mrs. Hatch brought them through a tiled hallway and down a back corridor to the kitchen, and the kitchen hit Máire like a physical blow. There was food on the table, a loaf of bread, dark and dense and still warm from the oven, a pot on the range from which a thick soup was turning slowly, a dish of actual butter, dried herbs hanging from the ceiling beams, jars of preserved vegetables along the shelves, a side of salted meat hanging from an iron hook by the window. The quantity of it was staggering. The normality of it, the absolute ordinariness of a kitchen with food in it, was, in November of 1847, more disorienting than anything strange could have been. She sat down at the table and ate bread and soup, and she did not think about anything while she ate. She was aware, at some distance, that she was shaking slightly, and that this was what happens when a body that has been insufficient for months is suddenly given what it needs, and she let herself shake and ate slowly because she knew enough to know that eating too fast would make her sick. Saoirse wept while she ate. Máire did not weep. She was saving her weeping for somewhere private, and what she was doing instead was looking. Mrs. Hatch moved through the kitchen with the silence of someone who has been doing the same task in the same space for a very long time and has compressed every motion down to its minimum. She filled bowls without being asked. She answered only direct questions and offered nothing beyond the answer. She showed them, when they had eaten, to their rooms, 2 small rooms in the east wing, clean, with proper beds and wool blankets and a fire already laid in each. Máire stood in the middle of her room and looked at the bed and the fire and the window that looked out onto the kitchen garden, and she felt the wrongness of all of it, and she did not let herself call that wrongness relief. She met the other guests that evening at dinner. The dining room was long and paneled, with a mahogany table that could have seated 20 and was currently laid for 7. She came in and found 4 people already at their places. A couple in their late 20s, a man in his early 60s, and a boy of perhaps 10. Mrs. Hatch stood at the sideboard. The 6th place was for Saoirse, who had been given the chance to wash and had emerged looking somewhat more present. The 7th place, at the head of the table, was empty. The couple were Saoirse and Sinead Foley, from near Kilrush. They had been at Morven House for 3 weeks, and they said this with a directness that acknowledged how it must sound. Saoirse had the look of a man who had been very thin and was beginning to fill in at the edges again. Eyes bright, face still hollowed from what he had been through, eating with the focused attention of someone who has not yet stopped being afraid of going hungry. Sinead was quieter. She had dark hair worn back simply, and she watched Máire across the table with a measuring expression that reminded Máire of herself, which she took for a good sign. The older man was Padraig Malone, who said he was from east of Ennis, and there was something about him she noted without being able to name it yet, a quality of the skin, a quality of the way he moved, and she filed it for later consideration. The boy was his nephew Tomás, 10 years old, who sat close to Padraig's arm and said nothing at all, looking at his food. They were all eating well, not with Máire's desperation but with the calmer appetite of people who had had several weeks to begin to trust the supply. She watched this carefully. She watched the way Padraig reached for the bread without looking at it, the automatic confidence of someone who has learned to stop fearing the table will be empty. She watched Sinead take a second ladleful of stew. These were people who were recovering. She noted it. She noted it the way she noted everything. Edmund Corrin arrived at dinner with the quiet authority of a man accustomed to arriving last. He was, she estimated, in his mid-50s, lean and of middle height, gray at the temples, with the kind of English face that generations of indoor life and good food had made. He dressed well without ostentation. He had fine hands and a manner of attention that felt, in the moment of its application, entirely genuine. He sat at the head of his table and greeted each guest in turn, using their names correctly, remembering what Fitzmaurice had told him about each of them, asking specific rather than general questions. Not how are you faring, but how is the soup? Was the room warm enough? Had the children of such a place fared better or worse than the adults? What had old Fionborough been teaching when the school finally closed? He was educated in the way of a man who had read a great deal across a great many subjects, and who had the particular blind spots that wide reading does nothing to correct. He spoke about the famine that evening with scholarly sorrow, the kind that observes suffering from a comfortable distance and finds it interesting without becoming implicated in it. He used words like catastrophe and unprecedented. He mentioned the failures of policy in London, with a measured regret that managed to convey no personal accountability whatsoever. He asked Máire and Saoirse about their townships and their families with a quality of attention that would have seemed, in a different room and a different year, like genuine interest. Máire answered his questions and ate carefully and watched him. After dinner, he showed them the library and said they were welcome to use it whenever they wished. He said they were free to use any room in the house during daylight hours. He said the West Wing was undergoing some maintenance and was not currently accessible, but that everything else was open to them. He said they were to think of Morven House as their home for as long as they needed it. He said this warmly, with an evident sincerity that she noted the way she noted everything, not dismissing it but not entirely trusting it either, holding it in the column of things not yet categorized. She lay in her bed that night and listened to the house. Old houses have a language of settling timbers and shifting drafts and the particular acoustics of stone rooms in cold weather, and she lay and listened to this language for a long time. And beneath it, after perhaps an hour, she heard something else. From below the ground floor, from somewhere beneath the house, further down than the kitchen and the pantry, from somewhere that was in the earth itself. A sound with a quality of presence to it. A sound that suggested something alive rather than something structural. Something that had a rhythm to it, not mechanical, not the rhythm of a clock or a pump, but biological, the rhythm of something breathing or pulsing in the dark. She listened to it for a long time without being able to name it, and then she closed her eyes, and she did not sleep well. She began, the following morning, to map the house. She was methodical about this, as she was methodical about everything, going through each accessible room and corridor with the attention she had once given to a complicated text, following its structure, marking its contradictions, noting where the floor plan did not quite account for itself. Most of what she found was ordinary. The library was well stocked, mostly English texts, natural history and classical, and some recent philosophy. The morning room looked east over the bare kitchen garden wall. The drawing room looked south over an avenue of beeches. The ground floor was generously proportioned and well maintained, and gave up no particular information beyond its own comfort. On the third day, she went to the kitchen garden. She went in the early morning before the others were awake, in the flat gray light that was honest in the way that later light is not. The garden was inside its own walled enclosure, entered through a wooden door in the east wall that was unlocked. She went in and stood still for a moment and looked at what was in front of her. The garden grew. Not merely grew, it thrived, in a November that was killing everything outside the walls, with a density and vigor that she could not account for with any natural explanation she possessed. The rows of kale were full and dark, their leaves wide and without blemish or frost damage. The turnips were large and sound, their tops pushing above the soil with the aggressive health of summer plants. There were leeks, onions, some kind of root vegetable she did not recognize, and all of it was dense with life. The beds were orderly and recently tended. She could see the marks of digging, the careful mounding of soil around the plant bases, and yet she had not seen anyone tending them in the 3 days she had been here, and she would not see anyone tend them in all the time she stayed. She crouched and put her fingers into the soil between a row of leeks. The soil of County Clare was famously difficult, thin, stony, needing constant amendment, and in this November almost certainly frozen or waterlogged in most places. This soil was different in every particular. It was dense and dark, almost black, with a richness that felt wrong under her fingers. Not the wrong of something rotten, but the wrong of something excessive, something that had been accumulating for a very long time. It was warm slightly, as though something below the surface was generating heat. And when she pushed her fingers deeper and then pulled them out, the soil clung to her hand not in the ordinary way of earth, but more specifically, more adhering, as though there were something fibrous threaded through it that had wound around her fingers while she wasn't watching. She looked at her hand in the flat winter light. There were fine white threads on her skin, thinner than hair, too many of them branching at angles too regular to be random. She rubbed them off on her skirt. She stood up. She looked at the rows of impossible vegetables for a long time. Then she went back inside and washed her hands 3 times at the kitchen pump. She said nothing about this to anyone. She did not stop eating. Her body would not permit it. After months of near starvation, in the presence of food, the body does not reason. It simply acts, and she let it act because she had no choice. But she began, from that morning forward, to eat less than she was given. She left portions on her plate. She slipped bread into her pocket at meals and hid it in her room, under the mattress. She drank the soup, but was selective about the solid pieces in it. She did not let herself fully articulate why she was doing this. She filed it under the single-word caution and went about her days. The weeks at Morven House had a rhythm to them that was seductive in the way that all necessary things are seductive when you have been starved of them long enough. Breakfast at 7, always. Bread, porridge, sometimes eggs. Dinner at noon. Supper in the evening when Corin joined them and talked and asked his careful questions, and listened to the answers with what appeared to be genuine interest. Between meals, they were free to do whatever they wished. Sinead had asked for sewing work, and Mrs. Hatch had provided it without comment or surprise. Sire Ron went to the stable yard each morning, not because he was asked to, but because he was that kind of man, the kind who finds purpose in useful work. Padraig sat mostly by the fire in the morning room and dozed with his large hands in his lap, and she let herself look at him sometimes while he slept, assessing what she saw. Tamaz, the boy, began to speak to her in the second week. He had been silent for so long, through the worst of what his family had been through the journey here, through the first strange days, that, when he finally spoke, it was with the tentative quality of someone testing whether words still worked the way they used to. He asked her what she was reading in the library. He told her that he had been learning his letters before the school closed. She offered to help him continue, and his face did something complicated when she said this, and he agreed, and they sat together at the library table in the mornings, and she taught him his letters and his numbers with the same careful attention she had given every child at Fionborough's school, and she found in those hours something that felt almost like the life she had intended to have. It was Tamaz who brought her the first of the observations she had been gathering and could not yet make sense of. He said to her one morning, across the library table, that Padraig's hair had come out in the night. He said it carefully, the way he said everything, without drama, simply reporting a fact that he felt she should know. Padraig had found a great deal of it on his pillow when he woke, enough to worry him, and he had said it was nothing, only the stress of the past months catching up with him, that this happened sometimes to men his age after a hard time. Tamaz had thought about this and had decided he did not think it was nothing. Máire told him that he was right to pay attention to things that seemed wrong. She meant it. She added it to her accounting. She had been watching Padraig carefully since her arrival, and the change she was observing in him was accelerating in the 6th week and 7th week of her stay, which was the 9th and 10th week of his. It was not only the hair. His movements had slowed in a way that was not the ordinary slowing of rest after hardship. It was effortful. His limbs appeared heavier than they should have been, as though something in them had changed in density or weight. His skin had taken on a color she associated with the later stages of illness, a grayness beneath the surface color, as though the warm blood of him were withdrawing inward, and leaving the exterior to its own resources. He ate with appetite, more appetite than before, if anything, and yet he looked worse each week. Sinead's changes were different and more subtle, but they were there. A pallor that was not the pallor of recovery, but of depletion, the specific white of someone whose blood has been diminished. Her hair, not lost as Padraig's was, but changed in quality, lying flat and dull as it had not when Máire first arrived. When Máire sat beside her at supper and asked how she was faring, Sinead said she was well, she was sleeping well, the food was good, she felt better than she had in over a year. And Máire looked at her and thought, she believes this. And she believed it because her body was being fed, and being fed felt like being well, and if something else was also happening, it was happening at a level below the body's ability to perceive. Sayran was energetic, active, always moving, measuring his own health by his capacity to move, and so the signs in him were harder to find. But she found them. He was sleeping longer than he had in the early weeks, and he was eating more, not less, which should not have been the case for a man whose body was stabilizing after a long period of deprivation. A body that is recovering normalizes its appetite. A body that is being drawn upon does not. She held all of this in her accounting and said nothing, and did not yet have enough to add it up to anything she could name. It was in her 5th week that she noticed the change in herself. She had been careful. She had been careful in a way that required active effort every single day, in a house that was warm and full of food, and where her body's entire history of the past year was screaming at her to eat what was offered and be grateful for it. She had been eating enough to maintain herself. She was not willing to die of self-imposed starvation inside a well-stocked house, but not the full portions offered, not the bread she hid, not the heaviest of what was served at supper. And despite this, something had shifted. It was a faint thing, a sense of insufficiency at a level below hunger, below thirst, below any ordinary category of bodily need. A sense of the body in deficit at some level she had no vocabulary for. And along with this, a tiredness that did not respond to rest. She had slept 8 hours and woken exhausted. She had slept 10 hours and the exhaustion was still there, sitting in her bones with a quiet patience that was more alarming than any acute pain would have been, because acute pain at least has an obvious relationship with something that caused it. She increased her caution. She ate almost nothing at supper that week, surviving on what she had hidden and on the slightly smaller portions she took at breakfast and noon. She was cold in the evenings and she was hungry, genuinely hungry, which she took as a sign of something important, because the others were not hungry and the others were not cold. The others were being sustained. She was still sustaining herself. The difference between those two things was the only margin she had, and she was not going to close it. In her 6th week, she heard the sound from beneath the house again on a still, windless night. And this time she could hear that it was larger than she had thought on the first night, and more specifically rhythmic, more definitely biological, more clearly the sound of something that was alive, and that was very large and very deep, and that was, in some way she could not yet account for, connected to the food that appeared on the table 3 times a day, and to the impossible garden on the other side of the kitchen garden wall. She found the cellar entrance in her 7th week, on a weekday morning when Mrs. Hatch was occupied with the laundry and the house was quiet. She had been working toward this since the 1st week, noting the floor plan's inconsistencies, the places where the house's proportions did not account for themselves, the sections where the acoustics of a room were fractionally wrong. She had identified, over the course of her daily mappings, a door in the pantry that was not a larder door. The measurements were wrong for a larder, the gap beneath it was wrong, the temperature differential of the air near it was wrong. The door was locked. She had, over the course of the previous several weeks, been making wax impressions of the unknown keys on Mrs. Hatch's ring. She had done this when opportunities arose, pressing each unfamiliar key briefly into a block of candle wax she kept in her apron pocket. She had 4 impressions. She had found in the stable yard a key blank, and she had spent evenings in her room filing it carefully by the firelight into approximations of each impression, working from the memory of what she had seen in Enistamin when she was a girl and had watched a man cut keys in a shop doorway, fascinated by the process. The result was rough and imprecise, and she was not certain any of them would work. The fourth attempt opened the door. The stairs descended into stone. They were worn smooth in the center by feet, decades of them, and there were no windows, only the light of her candle. The air changed as she went down, cooler, damper, and threaded with a smell that was organic and complex, not the smell of rot but of growth, of something alive in large quantities in an enclosed space. The main cellar was what she had expected, and more than she had expected, extensively vaulted, lined with shelves bearing more stored food than she could account for in any rational model of a house of this size. Ceramic jars of preserved vegetables sealed with wax, barrels of salted pork and beef, hung game from iron hooks along the ceiling, dried herbs in bundles, crates of hard cheese, more of everything than 7 people could consume in a year, in a country where 7 people would, in any other house, be unable to find enough to eat for a week. She moved through it with her candle and she catalogued it, because this was what she did. At the far end of the main cellar, in a wall that was in shadow and that she almost passed without examining, there was a low arch. Stone, older than the house above it. She had to duck to go through. The chamber on the other side was smaller, and the smell was stronger here. The smell of growth, of something biological and present, filling the space with a quality of aliveness that was distinct from the ordinary organic smells of a cellar. The floor was not flagstone. It was bare earth, dark earth, the same dense black earth of the kitchen garden, and it covered the entire floor of the chamber and ran up the base of the walls in a continuous mass. And the walls, she brought her candle close and looked. The walls were covered, from the floor to a height of perhaps 3 feet, with fine white threads. Not a coating, not a uniform layer, but a dense branching network of threads, each finer than a hair, covering the stone in the manner of a map or a diagram, following the cracks and the surfaces and sending finer threads out from each junction. The network moved, not dramatically, not visibly from moment to moment, but with the same quality of very slow motion that she had once observed in the shadows of a sundial as a child. The movement that is only perceptible if you look away and look back. She was still assessing this when she heard the voice from the far corner of the chamber. She had taken the far corner on first entry to be a pile of cloth or rags or blankets along the base of the wall. She raised her candle and moved toward it, and the rags resolved into a person lying on a low pallet, covered by 2 blankets, with her head propped on a rolled piece of cloth. The woman was looking at her. Her eyes were clear and entirely present, which was the most shocking thing about her, because the rest of her was devastation of a particular kind that Máire had never seen before, and that she understood immediately was not the devastation of the famine but something else entirely. She was skeletal, yes, more skeletal in the extremities than the worst of what Máire had seen on the roads, but the devastation was layered over that with something that had the appearance of extreme age. The skin of her face hung in folds that belonged on a woman of 80. Her hands, outside the blanket, were so deeply knuckled and so translucently thin that they appeared barely capable of grip. Her hair, what remained of it, was white and fine as the threads on the wall. And beneath all of this, like a drawing visible through paper held to the light, Máire could see that this woman had begun as a young woman. It was in the proportion of the face, the spacing of the eyes, the length of the neck. The structure that was being held together by this ruined exterior was the structure of someone who should not yet have been old. Her name was Bridget Cleary. She had come to Morven House in the autumn of 1845, in the first year of the Blight, when her family in Tipperary had exhausted everything they had, and she had walked to the nearest town and been told by a priest that there was a landlord in Clare who was taking in those who had need. She had been 30 years old. She had arrived thin and desperate as everyone arrived, and Mrs. Hatch had fed her, and she had eaten as everyone ate, because when you are starving and food is put in front of you and there is no obvious reason not to eat it, you eat it. She spoke clearly. Her voice was faint but precise, and she had clearly told this story before, or told it to herself often enough in the dark of the chamber that it had acquired the cleanness of something rehearsed. She told it without embellishment and without self-pity, in the manner of someone for whom self-pity was no longer useful and accuracy was the only remaining tool. The food changes you, she said. Not immediately. Not in the first days. The first weeks felt like recovery, real recovery, the body rebuilding itself after a long deprivation, the energy returning, the mind clearing, the weight coming back. It felt like being saved. She had been grateful. She had eaten everything that was offered and been grateful for every bite of it. The change begins so slowly you can explain it as anything. A tiredness that doesn't lift, a coldness in the blood that has no fever to explain it. The hair that Padraig lost, she had lost her hair too in the 3rd month. She had thought it was the stress of what she had been through. She had told herself this in 100 variations. Until the morning she looked at her hands and did not recognize them. The estate's soil, she said, and she looked at Máire and Máire said, yes, I have been to the garden, and Bridget closed her eyes briefly in something that was not relief but adjacent to it. The soil contains a living network. She had understood this slowly, through observation, through what she eventually found in this chamber. She would show Máire where it was, in a moment, and through what her own body had demonstrated to her in the most direct possible way. The network is mycological in nature. Threads of fungal matter finer than any thread a loom has ever made, running through all the soil of the estate and through the roots of everything that grows from it, and through the food that is made from those roots and that grain, and into the bodies of those who eat the food. Once it is in you, it becomes part of your body's processes, and then it does what it does in the soil, which is what all things do when they can. It draws nutrients from what is around it. Not blood, not anything as dramatic as that, something more fundamental. The biological vitality of the body, the processes that maintain cellular integrity and health, and the slow, ordinary work of being alive. The network taps into this and draws it back through the food chain, down through the roots, into the soil, where it feeds the next crop in a loop of extraction that is perfectly closed and perfectly efficient and absolutely terrible. The longer you eat from the estate, the deeper the network establishes itself in your tissues. And the deeper it goes, the more dependent you become on it. Because it does nourish you, it is genuinely feeding you. It is simply also feeding itself. And at a certain point, the network has become so embedded in your own processes that removing it, stopping eating from the estate, is not recovery. It is a severing. She had tried. She had gone 3 days without the food Mrs. Hatch brought down each morning, and on the 3rd day she could not move her limbs. And Mrs. Hatch had come and brought soup, and she had eaten it, and the worst of the crisis passed. She had not tried again. How long have you been eating from the estate? Bridget asked. 7 weeks, Máire said, but I have not been eating what they eat. Not fully. I noticed the soil. I was careful. Bridget was quiet for a moment. Then she said, then you may still be able to go. She told Máire where the journal was. A niche in the wall to the left of the arch, behind a stone that sat slightly proud of its neighbors. An oilskin package behind it. She said, take it. Take it and read it and carry it out of this place. Because I cannot go, and Padraig cannot go, and the Foleys have been here too long. And the boy, she paused, the boy may be able to go, but you cannot carry him through what you will have to do to get out. Take the journal and take yourself and put what you know in front of people who have the power to act on it. That is the only good that can still come from any of this. She told Máire one more thing before she went, and she said it quietly, as though even the network in the walls might hear her if she said it too loud. She said that Corin ate from the estate himself, in careful portions, measured doses, just enough. That was what the journal would explain. That was how he maintained himself while those he brought in were consumed more thoroughly. He had been doing this for a very long time. He was not a man in his 50s. He was the fourth or fifth generation of his family to manage the estate in this way, each inheriting not only the property but the method and the knowledge and the careful dosing that made it possible to live alongside the network without being taken by it entirely. Máire took the journal from the niche in the wall and went back up the stairs. She read it in her room by the fire, slowly and completely, taking most of an afternoon and evening for it, because she wanted to understand everything in it and miss nothing. The journal belonged to Aldous Coran, dated from 1692 to 1701. Aldous Coran had been, by his own account, a naturalist and amateur scientist of the late 17th century, a man of genuine intellectual curiosity who had come to the Irish estate. He inherited not with any interest in Ireland or its people, but with the specific ambition of a naturalist who wanted access to an unfamiliar landscape. He brought a microscope, a cabinet of specimens, books, and the absolute confidence of a wealthy, educated Englishman of his era, which was a confidence so deep and so unexamined that it functioned less like an emotion and more like a premise. The discovery was made in 1694. He had been investigating an anomalous growth in the kitchen garden, a section of soil that produced with extraordinary consistency while the surrounding beds failed, and under his microscope he found it. He described the mycological network with the breathless delight of a man who has found something genuinely new, something that has no precedent in any text he has read. He characterized its structure, its density, its apparent extent. He traced its threads into the roots of the garden's plants and understood that it was augmenting their productivity by drawing nutrients from deep in the subsoil and channeling them upward. He called it a marvel. He spent pages on the marvel. It took him 2 years to understand the other direction of the flow. He wrote, "I have been noting for some time that my own health at this estate has been superior to my health anywhere else I have lived. I am 43 years of age, and I had expected to begin feeling the encroachments of middle age on my body's functioning, but I do not feel them. I had attributed this to the Irish air, which is damp but clean. I now believe the attribution was incorrect, and that the cause is more specific. The network that flows through the estate's soil and through its produce also flows, in a diluted and diffuse way, into those who consume that produce. And the flow, I have determined, is not entirely one direction. Something is returned, something that I can only call biological vitality, though I do not yet have the vocabulary to describe it more precisely. My hands, which were beginning to show the first marks of a man's aging, appear today as a younger man's hands. This is not imagination. I have portraits made of myself at intervals. I am looking at them now." He recorded this without the slightest moral disturbance. He wrote about it with the scientific equanimity he would have brought to the description of a carnivorous plant or a parasitic insect. The mechanism was remarkable. The implications were worth pursuing. He noted the practical dimensions. The laborers on the estate who ate primarily from its produce were notably more vigorous than laborers elsewhere in the first months of their tenure, but showed an accelerating decline in subsequent years. He had noticed this for some time without understanding it. Now he understood it. He understood that the calibration was everything, that consuming too much, too freely, over too long a period, crossed a threshold beyond which the network established itself too deeply to leave room for the body's own independent functioning. It became the body's functioning, and when there was nothing left to draw from, it simply ended. He was clinical about this. He noted that the optimal arrangement, for the landlord's purposes, was to bring in new people regularly while maintaining the older ones at the minimum level of vitality required to keep them drawing from the network and therefore feeding back into the soil. It was, he wrote, a self-sustaining economy of remarkable elegance. The estate produced food. The food was consumed. The consumption fed the network fed the soil produced food. And at every stage of the loop, some fraction of vitality was drawn from the human participants and accumulated in the estate's biological mass, which expressed itself as productivity beyond what any merely agricultural explanation could account for. He called it, with an unself-consciousness that she found the most frightening thing in the entire journal, a pleasing compact between the land and those who used it. He wrote in the final entry, dated 17/1, "I am 50 years old. I appear 35, perhaps somewhat less. I have been eating from this estate for 7 years in portions carefully calibrated to gain the benefit without crossing the threshold of dependency. I intend to continue. This estate, managed correctly, will outlast any arrangement I could make by conventional means. It requires only that it be understood, and that those who manage it be willing to understand it fully, without flinching. I find that I am willing. I have always found the natural world more honest than the social world in its requirements. This is simply a more direct expression of what the natural world has always asked of us. Give something, take something, and do not pretend the transaction is anything other than what it is." She closed the journal and sat with it on her lap for a long time. Edmund Corrin was not a man in his mid-50s. He was the inheritor of a management practice that had been running for 150 years, passed down through a line of men who had each learned the calibration, and who had each lived, in their careful moderation, far longer than their years should have permitted. He had been sitting at the head of his dinner table asking questions about hedge schools and townlands, and expressing measured sorrow about government policy, while the people he had invited to his table were being drawn upon, slowly and thoroughly, in the direction of that dark soil, and the food that came back up from that soil and onto those pewter plates and into those warm bowls. The famine was not a crisis for Morven House. It was a recruitment mechanism. A country full of people with nothing left, who would step into a cart for the promise of food, who would eat gratefully and ask no questions for weeks or months, until the asking of questions became an academic matter because they could no longer leave to act on any answer. She went to find Corrin. He was in the library reading, as he spent his evenings. He looked up when she came in, and she saw, behind the expression he arranged, the very slight adjustment of a man who has been expecting this. He closed his book. He said, "Miss Ó'Súilleabháin, will you sit?" She sat. She put the journal on the table between them. He looked at the journal and then at her, and she could see him making his assessment and arriving at the truth of the situation, and deciding that the truth was, at this point, the only thing worth saying. He said, "You have been eating very carefully," she said, "since the 3rd day." He looked at her with something she could not precisely name. It was not admiration, and it was not contempt, and it was not quite respect, but it occupied the territory near all three of those things. He said, "That is extraordinary discipline for a person in your condition when you arrived." She said, "What happens to those who cannot leave?" He said, "They are cared for. They are warm. They are fed. They are not suffering in any immediate or acute sense." She said, "They are being consumed." He said, "The network requires what it requires. I did not create it. I found it and came to understand it." She said, "And you use it." He leaned back slightly in his chair and looked at her with an expression that she recognized from other men. The expression of a man who is about to explain something he believes is obvious to someone he believes has missed the obvious. He said that he provided food and shelter to people who would otherwise die in a ditch, which was more than any government in London had managed. He said that the famine was killing 1 million people, and he was keeping several alive. He said that the network had been operating for a century and a half, and would continue operating long after both of them were gone, and that his participation in it was simply the honest acknowledgement of a mechanism that existed whether he acknowledged it or not. She said, "You bring starving people here so that their desperation causes them to absorb the network more completely and more quickly than people who are not starving, so that you have a more efficient supply of the vitality the network requires. The charity is a method. The keeping alive is the mechanism, not the purpose." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said that he did not believe there was a meaningful distinction between the mechanism and the purpose in a world arranged the way this world was arranged. He said that the English management of Ireland had always worked on the same fundamental logic: extract from the land, extract from the people on the land, maintain the apparatus of extraction, ensure the continuation of the estate. He was, he said, more honest about the mechanics of it than most men in his position, and he thought honesty had to count for something. She found this the most frightening thing he said, because she could see the internal logic of it, and she could see how a man with a certain kind of mind, over a century and a half of this particular management, could arrive at a place where the logic felt not only coherent but righteous. She was not going to find the crack in it sitting in this library. She was not going to find the argument that would move him. She stood up. "There is a woman in your cellar," she said, "who is 30 years old and looks 90. He said, "Bridget has been with us for 2 years. I regret that she was not more cautious in the early weeks. She is beyond the threshold now." She said, "You regret it." He said, "She is less useful to the estate's balance in her current condition than she would have been in a more moderate arrangement. Yes, I regret it from a practical standpoint." She left the library and went upstairs. She gave herself exactly 1 hour to be cold and furious and frightened, sitting in the dark of her room with the fire going low, because she did not want to ask Mrs. Hatch for more coal, and she did not want to interact with anyone in this house unless it was necessary. She sat with the feeling for an hour. She named it. She was frightened because she had been here 7 weeks, and she did not know precisely where she stood in relation to the threshold Bridget had described. She was furious because she had been furious at the management of this country for long enough that it was becoming a permanent condition of her interior life, and she did not want it to be that. She was cold because the fire was going low and because November in County Clare is cold, and some conditions are simply conditions. After an hour she began to plan. The planning took 4 days. She continued her ordinary routine of the house: breakfast, library with Tamaz in the mornings, dinner, the afternoon hours, supper with Corin's measured conversation. And she continued to eat almost nothing, surviving on what she had stored and on the smallest portions she could manage without drawing attention. She watched Sayran and Sinead at supper and understood, without wanting to understand it, that they had been here too long. 2 months of full, trusting meals. She thought about what Bridget had described: 3 days without the estate's food and the inability to move. She thought about what 2 months of unrestricted consumption would mean against that measure. She did not let herself feel what she felt about this conclusion, because feeling it would not change it, and she needed all of her capacity for the planning. Padraig was, she had to acknowledge, already gone beyond any intervention available to her. 10 weeks. The quality of his skin and movement told her what 10 weeks of full consumption had done to a man his age. She thought about Tamaz. She sat with Tamaz over his letters in the mornings and looked at him, this boy with his careful, watchful face, and she wanted very much to find a way to add him to her plan. She went through every version of it she could construct, and each version collapsed at the same point. She could not control what he ate. She could not control whether he would stay quiet during an escape. She could not carry him if he faltered, and she could not afford to falter. She had one chance at this, in a body that was already compromised in winter, at night, alone. She came to the decision she came to, and she did not let herself pretend it did not cost her something. She needed 4 things: the journal, which she had; a dry night, or at least a night without heavy rain; a route that did not require passing the gate; and the capacity of her body to hold together long enough to reach help. The route she had identified in her daily walks. The kitchen garden wall at its northeast corner had a section where the pointing had deteriorated over the years, and where horizontal joints at regular intervals could serve as footholds. She had tested this on a dry morning when Mrs. Hatch was in the dairy. The wall was 9 feet. She was not certain she could do it. She was nearly certain. She filed nearly certain under sufficient. The dry night came on a Thursday in her 8th week. She lay in her bed until the house had been silent for 2 hours, listening to everything: the settling of the timbers, the movement of the drafts, the sound from beneath the floorboards, slower and deeper tonight, slower than she had heard it before, like the respiration of something very large in a deep and ancient sleep. She dressed in everything she had. She packed the journal under her bodice against her skin, wrapped in its oilskin, where the warmth of her body and the protection of the leather would keep it dry. She put her father's rosary in her pocket and the small knife, and she left her room in the dark and went down the stairs without a candle, one hand on the wall, placing each foot with care, through the kitchen, which was cold and dark and smelled of the supper that had been, and out through the kitchen door into the yard, and from the yard along the narrow path to the garden wall. The night was clear and very cold. Stars, which meant the ground frost would be hard by morning, which meant the stone of the wall would be icy. She tested the first foothold with the toe of her boot, and it held, and she found the next joint and the next, and she climbed in the dark with her fingers in the cold gaps of the stone and her arms shaking with the cold, and with the effort and with something else, something that was not quite fear. And at the top of the wall, she sat for a moment on the 9-inch width of the capstones and looked out at what was on the other side. Ireland, the real Ireland of November 1847. Not green, not warm, not alive in any visible way, the flat dark of a winter night over empty fields, the gray gleam of a road in the middle distance, the silhouette of a bare and leafless tree against the stars, the sound of wind over land that had nothing left to muffle it. It was the world as it actually was, stripped and cold and honest, and she looked at it for a long moment and felt something that was not quite relief and not quite grief, and that occupied the narrow space between those two things where the truth tends to live. She dropped from the wall and she walked 12 miles. She had walked it before in the other direction in a cart, and it had seemed long then. She walked it now on foot in the dark of a November night in a body that had been eating carefully for 8 weeks in the middle of a famine, which meant a body that was not well, not strong, not equal to what she was asking of it. She knew this and she walked anyway. She talked to herself quietly in Irish, naming the things she passed: a ditch, a field, a section of broken wall, a crossroads with a broken signpost, a long straight stretch of road with the Milky Way overhead like a road for something larger than her, a ford across a small stream that was icy when the water went into her boots and made her gasp and keep moving. She was dizzy from the 4th mile onward. She was shaking, and it was not only the cold. Around the 7th or 8th mile something happened with her vision that she did not let herself think about, and that resolved itself after 100 yards of walking with her hand on the wall of a roadside ditch. So she kept walking. She reached the Quaker relief station at Anistaman as the sky was beginning to lighten in the east. She had been walking for 5 hours. She knocked at the door, and the door was opened by a young man in a nightshirt holding a candle who looked thoroughly and entirely astonished to find her there. And she said to him in English, clearly and directly, "My name is Máire Ó'Súilleabháin, and I have testimony to give and evidence to provide, and I need paper and ink, and I need someone with authority to sit down and listen. I have walked 12 miles, and I need to do this before I lose the capacity to do it clearly." He sat her down and he went to find the committeeman. She gave the testimony. She gave the journal. She spent 4 hours with Thomas Bully when he arrived at 7 in the morning, answering his questions precisely and completely, correcting him twice when he misunderstood a detail, asking him once to repeat back to her what she had said about the mycological network to confirm he had written it accurately. She asked what would be done. He said the matter would be forwarded to Dublin and that he would personally ensure it was accompanied by his own memorandum. She asked him what specifically his own memorandum would say. He told her. She told him 2 points she thought his memorandum was missing, and he added them. She was satisfied with this, which was not the same as being confident that anything would come of it, but satisfaction with the process was the only kind of satisfaction available to her, and she took it. She never went back to Morven House. She never learned, in all the years that followed, what became of Sire Ron and Sinead Foley, or of Padraig Malone and the boy Tomás, or of Bridget Cleary, who had arrived at Morven House as a 30-year-old woman in the first year of the famine, and whose name Máire had written carefully in capital letters in her testimony, so that it could not be overlooked. She had done what she could do. She had carried what she could carry. The rest she could not carry, and she had known this from the moment she climbed the northeast corner of that garden wall, and she had climbed it anyway, because carrying the truth was not nothing. She told herself this, and she believed it, and she also knew that the difference between not nothing and enough is a measurement she would spend the rest of her life taking. Her mother Nora survived the workhouse at Enistamin and came home in 1849 and lived another 8 years, long enough to see Kilcrony begin its long and halting return to something that might, in time, resemble the place it had been. Sayamas emigrated to Boston in 1851 and wrote to her regularly, careful letters in the clear hand she had helped him build, reporting on a life that was hard in different ways than the old life had been, but that contained, from his letters, the sense of a future, which was more than she could have claimed for him in the November of 1847. She moved to Cork in 1850 and found work, and made a life of the kind available to her. A small life, by most measures, but a life conducted with the same precision and the same habit of notice that had carried her out of Morven House over a garden wall in the dark. She wrote the testimony a second time from memory in 1855 and submitted it to a priest in Cork who kept it in a parish archive. That version has not been located. Morven House estate still stands. It has changed hands several times. The kitchen garden wall, visible in aerial photographs taken in recent decades, appears intact. The soil of the estate is, according to a 2019 agricultural survey conducted in connection with a planning application for a section of the grounds, extraordinarily rich for the region, dense, dark, biologically complex, in ways that the surveyor noted were anomalous, and that he attributed in his report to exceptional long-term organic management. He did not dig deeper than 6 inches. In a country that was losing 1 million people to starvation, one house was full of food. In a house full of food, a woman who noticed the soil and rubbed the white threads from her fingers and ate carefully and hid bread under her mattress and filed a key blank by firelight and climbed a 9-foot wall in the dark. That woman survived. Not because the world was just, not because the truth she carried made anyone accountable, but because she stayed hungry in a house that wanted to feed her, and she walked when she did not know if she could walk, and she wrote it down. The writing is here.